Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating analysis from our source material about the historical and legal frameworks of the Islamic Caliphate. Specifically, we're looking at how it treated its non-Muslim citizens. Now, this is a topic that generates a ton of intense debate today, right? So our goal here is to just objectively map out how the source text unpacks and counters some really prevalent modern narratives using historical and legal records. Let's get right into it. Okay, so the source kicks things off by addressing some pretty widespread modern critiques. Take a look at this quote. You hear arguments like this a lot, claiming that this historical system forced non-Muslims into a terrified, oppressed, servile existence. Well, the text we're examining today sets out to challenge that perspective head-on, arguing that claims like these completely miss the actual legal framework of the time. To unpack all these claims impartially, we're going to structure our explainer into 5 specific areas: citizenship in Islam, justice and the courts, the economy and jizya, community relations, and finally, government and freedom. Starting off with Section 1, Citizenship in Islam, defining the dhimmi. Now, what's really interesting here is that the source highlights the actual Arabic root word, dhimma. Instead of subjugation, it literally translates to a pledge or a protective covenant. According to the text, this was essentially a formal state guarantee to protect these citizens and, crucially, to strictly not interfere with their specific beliefs or ways of worship. Basically, the text argues that citizenship was strictly geographical, meaning if you lived permanently in the Islamic State, you enjoyed foundational civil rights, totally regardless of your creed. The source emphasizes that the state was actually forbidden from discriminating based on race or religion when it came to your basic civic standing. So you didn't have to adopt the state's ideology to be considered a full-fledged citizen. Okay, so that all sounds very organized in theory, right? But you might be wondering what actually happens when non-Muslims enter the Islamic legal system. Does that theory hold up in practice when real disputes happen? That brings us to a major point of contention. How did this wildly diverse population actually interact with the justice system? Let's move to Section 2, Justice and the Courts, and Equality under the Law. So, a super common modern argument, like the one from author Bat Ye'or highlighted in our text, is that non-Muslims were strictly forbidden from giving evidence against Muslims. The idea here is that this created a deeply unequal playing field where a non-Muslim could just never realistically win a court case. But here's where the text pushes back hard. It points to the actual legal requirements for witnesses at the time. To testify, a witness just had to be sane, mature, and trustworthy. That's it. The source emphatically states that because being trustworthy absolutely wasn't exclusive to Muslims, non-Muslim testimony was entirely valid and accepted in Islamic courts. And the source reinforces this with a pretty amazing historical anecdote. Get this. The mighty Caliph Ali actually lost a court case to a Jewish citizen. Why? Because the judge impartially accepted the citizen's testimony over the caliph's. The text uses this to show that literally no one, not even the head of state, was above the law, and that justice was designed to be structurally blind to religious affiliation. All right, so having mapped out the legal theory and the judicial records, we've got to look at the financial reality, right? I mean, a fair court is one thing, but how did the economic system, specifically taxation, treat these citizens? That takes us to Section 3, the economy and jizya, focusing on wealth, taxes, and welfare. The text outlines that taxes were actually applied differently based on belief, but specifically to prevent oppression. So Muslims paid zakat, which was a wealth tax, while non-Muslims paid the jizya, a head tax. The source stresses this wasn't just arbitrary discrimination. Because non-Muslims didn't share the state's ideology, they were completely exempted from compulsory military service. So the jizya was paid in lieu of that military duty, while Muslims who had to serve were entirely exempt from the jizya. Now, the source notes that some modern commentators claim this jizya was an arbitrary, punishing 50% tax, meant to intentionally impoverish people until they converted. 50%. That's a striking number for sure. But the text argues it's just historically inaccurate. When you actually look at the historical data, like from Egypt and Asham, the source points out that jizya was highly scaled to prosperity. The wealthy paid 4 gold dinars, the middle class paid 2, and the worker paid just 1. Plus, and this is a big point in the text, there were total exemptions for women, children, and the poor who had no livelihood. The state was legally forbidden from overburdening anyone beyond what they could actually afford. To illustrate the welfare side of things, the text brings up Caliph Umar. The story goes that he found an older non-Muslim man begging and immediately established a permanent state pension for him straight out of the treasury. According to the source, the caliph essentially said it was totally unjust to collect taxes from citizens in their youth, only to neglect them when they got old. The text argues this proves non-Muslims had full access to the state's economic safety net. So law and taxes are foundational, right? But they don't really tell us what it was like to just walk down the street as a neighbor in this empire. We really have to ask, what about daily life, community integration, and politics? Which brings us to Section 4, Community and Social Relations, Living Side by Side. The historical accounts cited by our source, especially from places like Islamic Spain, show this incredibly deep, peaceful assimilation and social freedom. This totally counters the narrative that these groups lived in constant fear. The text points to frequent intermarriages and shared cultural customs, basically painting a picture of a society where totally different religious groups lived side by side, did business together, and genuinely shared their communities. Finally, Section 5, Government and Freedom, focusing on political participation. Okay, so while non-Muslims couldn't hold supreme ideological leadership roles, like, being the caliph, the text argues they were fully permitted to be civil servants and department directors. And importantly, they could serve in the Majlis al-Nawab, the elected council. This meant they could freely voice their political opinions and actually hold the government accountable. The source also uses this specific Quranic verse, "Let there be no compulsion in religion," to firmly counter the myth that the empire expanded by forcing conversions. The text explicitly notes that historic churches and synagogues were protected by the state. The government was legally prohibited from interfering in the internal religious matters, dietary laws, or marriage customs of its non-Muslim citizens. So to wrap this up, this explainer maps out how the source text thoroughly attempts to counter modern criticisms. The text argues that this historical framework offered structured equality rather than some servile, oppressed existence. From the courts all the way to the treasury, the source presents a case for a highly structured, law-bound society that guaranteed rights based on residency, not ideology. As we finish up, I want to leave you with this. Ask yourself, how does a deeper, fact-based look into historical and legal governance shift our perspective on the highly charged political rhetoric we hear so much of today? When we break down the primary sources, it really challenges a lot of common modern narratives. Thank you so much for exploring this source material with us today, and keep asking those great questions.